Welcome back to the line. Another new year. This is actually, I guess, the third calendar year we've been operating in, although we've only actually been operating less than 18 months. The way we've scheduled it is this is our third calendar year. So it's great to be back. We've had a nice holiday. I don't know if we're well rested enough. Jen, let me just ask you the question. I was off for basically 2 solid weeks. And
Yep.
I probably actually only began to kind of unclench and unwind on like day 10 or 11.
Yeah.
This is going to be an extremely first world privilege comment. I actually think I needed about another week of vacation because I actually think I've only really gotten about 2 or 3 days of relaxing because after 2 years of this, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I have just like I think a lot of us have been at a really high level of, I don't even want to call it stress, but I'm just going to call it like the brain has been going constantly. And
Yeah. Crisis space.
yeah, and for
Yeah.
some of us as well, it's not just the brain, it's working constantly. So I think I would have liked a bit more time off, but again, I am checking my privilege when I say that. It's right where I left it.
Well, also, I mean, it's the old saying about how people with kids, and you and I both have young kids, like Christmas isn't really a vacation in the same way. Like, I worked my ass off through Christmas to get all the decorations up and make like the meals perfect. Like, I was actually going to write a column. I completely never got to it because I was working my butt off to make Christmas perfect. And the other thing that I have found is that, like, I have started to take on, because work stress and just life stress gets to me, I need to take on hobbies. So I've discovered this about myself during COVID. When the weather's really good, I do gardening. I get outside and I garden. And I've now started to take up sewing. So instead of fighting on Twitter, which is really good for me and also productive, also great for me professionally, I instead like go and I sew really cute things for my daughter. I sewed her this like amazing little, how shall I say this amazing little dress. Here, I'll show it to you. It's the prettiest little thing I've ever seen in my life. Here, this is a great one. You can see her in it. Look at how great she is. Anyway, so now I'm like obsessed with collecting fabrics and I sew instead of being on Twitter. And this has been really, really good for me. But I also find that kind of the week after Christmas and before New Year's, you're just in that horrible, foggy, I can't function, I can't think straight. I thought I was going to get like a chapter of my book done. And I was like, no, I'm going to lie on the couch and let my children watch television. That's what I'm going to that's what's going to happen this week.
It's funny because I mentioned this. You've mentioned fighting on Twitter. I deleted Twitter for the entirety of the holiday. Every couple of days on my computer, I would check for any direct messages, and other than that, I was off. What I was doing, and I wasn't doing this in this big showy way. There actually was an American journalist who did this for a long form essay. I'm blanking on his name. It'll come to me later. Wrote it for Slate or The Atlantic, where he decided to spend 1 month consuming news like it was the 1980s. So he would read a newspaper in the morning, listen to AM radio a couple of times a day in the car just to get those headlines. And he would watch like the 11 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news after the kids went to bed.
Sure.
And I wasn't doing it like in a performative way, but that's basically what I was doing over the holidays as well. So I wanted to be done everything on December 17th, which was the Friday. I couldn't do it. I needed the weekend and Monday, the 20th, to just tie up loose ends. And then I was done. Deleted all my email and work apps off my phone, put my laptop away because my laptop is mostly my work computer. And what I would do every morning, I would read a local newspaper basically to find out what's open today, what's closed, what's the weather going to be. And if I was in my car, I would put on a local AM radio station and hear headlines, and that was it. And people like at Christmas, at New Year's, people are like, "Hey Matt, like, what do you think about what's going on in the news?" Because they know I'm a news guy. I'm like, I don't know.
So you've embraced the 80s news information. I just became an 80s housewife. So I didn't even do that. I was cooking, sewing, and cleaning. That's what I did for the last 2 weeks. I don't even know what's going on. I don't know. I made some cute shit.
I think we both have the beginnings of maybe a pair of essays we publish next to each other at the line. Our week reliving the 80s.
Yeah. I took up smoking. I sent the kids out into the wilderness. It was fantastic.
I infiltrated the Soviet Union.
Perfect.
It is interesting though, like when you work in the news, to actually be on vacation.
You're never on vacation because your brain never stops.
Well, it does now because I make it. And this is something I started to do only in recent years, where I actually have a separate device that I use when I'm on vacation so that people can reach me in emergency, but it's not connected to anything. And it's kind of like in order to actually be on holiday, I need to slam the door completely.
Nobody cares about our problems, Matt. We should talk about the news now.
Let's talk about the news now.
Okay. So let's recap. Before we went on break, we said, look, there's two plausible scenarios that we are facing with scenario 3A here 2A here that is it could happen in either case. Either Omicron spreads like wildfire, everybody's going to get it, but it's going to be sufficiently mild that it's not going to matter all that much. It's not going to overwhelm our healthcare system. It'll burn itself out relatively quickly and we'll move on. Or the apocalyptic scenario where Omicron's going to spread like wildfire, everybody is going to get it. And because it's so transmissible, even though it's going to be a less serious illness, enough people are going to get sick with it that it will overwhelm hospitals and ICUs. And then scenario 2A, which could happen in either scenario, which is that even in the optimistic or in the pessimistic scenario, it's possible that we're going to have so many people isolating that we're going to have shutdowns of certain services, transit, like there's might not be able to be enough people to keep certain things open, certain bus routes going. So you should expect weird, unexpected, sporadic delays of services. So I'm happy to report we seem to be in scenario 1. We seem to be in the optimistic scenario where, yes, it's spreading like wildfire. Everybody has it. All of your friends have it. All of my friends have it. Everybody got it over the holidays. For some people, it was more or less serious. I think my stepmom has it right now. And she's like, no, it was a pretty serious flu. And, it took me down for about 3 days. For younger people, tending to be, I've had people literally say, I've had cold sores hit me harder than this. It's not that big a deal. But nowhere in the world, a month into Omicron, nowhere in the world appears to find that their healthcare systems have been inundated or overwhelmed. There's certainly been an uptick in certain places. Cases have gone absolutely bonkers, but we have seen a real, almost total decoupling of these crazy case rates from death and adverse hospitalization rates. Now, there are still some people who are very cautious about this. They're saying, no, we're going to start to see the ICUs be overwhelmed in the next week or two. If that were going to happen, we would expect to be seeing it happen somewhere by now, and it isn't. So, all caveats are also required because we don't want to make a mistake, but it does seem to be that we're heading toward the optimistic scenario. And I don't know about you, Matt, but there was really no breakdown in services during the holidays. Everything seemed to be more or less fine. We were running short on milk in Alberta just as a result of what was happening in BC. So weird stuff like that's still happening, but things seem to be okay. Right? Am I wrong?
I think what's interesting is I've been talking to, even over the holidays, I tried to avoid this, but I did talk to some of my public health nerds. And I'm talking to them like, what are you worried about? And there's still concern about the state of our hospital system, but it's no longer concern about the virus. It's no longer a concern that here is a virus that is going to overwhelm our ability to care for people. The concern has become we have a feeble, underfunded healthcare system. And
this is the systemic issue we've been talking about for the last 2 years. Yeah.
And what was interesting is our mutual friend, Kaveh Sharuz, I reinstalled Twitter today. I'm probably going to end up regretting it by the end of the day. He yesterday had posed 2 questions. And the questions he posed were incredibly reasonable. He said, to the people who oppose lockdowns, what would you recommend Ontario do? That was it. To the people who support lockdowns, what would be your metric for ending it? Yep. And I stopped reading the replies eventually. But I did send him just a private note of going, no one is answering your questions. They're replying to your question, but they're not answering them.
That's right.
Everybody on both sides was rejecting the premise of the question.
Yeah.
And, you know, the people who were rejecting the premise of the question on the base when he asked what to the lockdown advocates, what would be your metric for ending it? There isn't any. There is, we've waited too long. For the people who oppose lockdowns, there was one shining example of we should have spent 2 years fortifying the healthcare system. Yeah.
Yes, but we didn't. So now what?
And it's like I'm just imagining standing on the deck of an ocean liner and the frigid North Atlantic waters are up to my knees. And someone, you say to me, hey, Matt, should we get into a lifeboat? I'm like, no, we should have missed the iceberg. Like at a certain point, it's not helpful.
But you're right, except that I can answer Kavish-Shrews's question from both perspectives here, and that from the anti-lockdown perspective, nothing. We should do nothing because there's nothing we can do that's going to make any difference anyway. Like it's done. And from the pro-lockdown perspective, I would say you need to come up with. We need to do an average of like what the seasonal capacity of the ICU system is at this point in the year, and when our ICU capacity hits that, depending on where the trend lines are going, that's when we ease up. That would be my answer. I think those could be rational. What the ceiling is.
Ceiling below it. It's
put a caution.
This.
Yeah. Exactly. And this is where, you know, the Ontario Science Modeling Table could be useful if it chose to be useful, which it isn't. So anyway, Matt, I would like to point out that you are someone who's kind of kept me from going more red pill on COVID stuff. And you and I have actually had some back and forth, and you've challenged me on stuff. And you know, sometimes you've been right, and sometimes I think I've been right. And like we have been a good balancing factor for one another on a lot of this stuff. You're a little bit more, I don't know if pessimistic is the right word because I'm very dark, but
I am inherently conservative, which is
you're inherent
to what we were saying earlier.
Yeah, you're inherently conservative, where I'm one of those people who I'm kind of more of a libertarian style conservative, where I'm just like that. I'm a little bit more on that then. So we've had a good tension there. So I have to say, to me, given what's happening around the world, given the real world data for Omicron is coming out as overwhelmingly optimistic, our response to Omicron seems to be all based on scary looking case numbers, and almost none of it seems to be as a response to the not at all scary looking healthcare numbers. And as a result, we're imposing more and more draconian lockdowns and school closures at a moment when it makes the least possible sense. And, you know, from the batshit crazy libertarian COVID perspective, I'm going, this looks nuts.
Yeah.
Is this nuts?
A lot of it's nuts.
Okay, cool. So I'm not completely out to lunch. You're telling me this looks nuts, because a lot of the stuff that they're doing, like the curfews in Quebec, the shutting down the school system, the shutting down the school system is particularly evil because once again, we're punishing children for an illness that literally can't harm them, like or statistically is very unlikely to harm them. So that to me is just actually we're in evil territory now. And nothing, but even these measures, like nobody can answer how much time do you expect any of this is going to buy with a disease that is as transmissible as it is? Like is all this going to buy a week, a day? Like what's the, like nobody's even bothering to answer. I think that they are frantically going back to the greatest hits. They're frantically going back to the only thing they think can possibly work. And they're doing it just to say, hey, we're doing something because we know you're scared of these case rates. None of this is rational. None of this is grounded in science. This is just panic. I think this is all just panic response. That's what it feels like to me.
I generally have been the more conservative, or I would say cautious, of the two of us. And one of the things I said very early in the pandemic, I said it to you, I've said it publicly, is something that scared me, was that we, instead of viewing this as a novel, unusual threat, we just immediately folded this into our pre-existing political, ideological beliefs. So our personal response to COVID was pretty predictable based on if you were a liberal or an NDP or a conservative. Well, like it wasn't 100%, but it was a really good predictor.
And that makes sense, because if you're coming at things from a certain sort of political worldview, or like, it's not even political, a political or certain ideology, that's rooted in your psychology, that's rooted in your experience, that's rooted in your beliefs of the world. So it would make sense that you are going to integrate or synthesize the experience of the pandemic according to that existing framework, right?
And I think as well, I think that's the positive way of saying it. I'm going to add the negative way also, in-group enforcement of right think.
100%. 100%.
People,
yeah.
People on the right who are thinking, maybe we should lock down so that we don't have a bunch of people die of preventable cancers. They wouldn't feel comfortable saying that. And then meanwhile, on the left, people who are like, I don't know if it's worth derailing the educations of all these kids, probably wouldn't want to say that either. So,
and also on the left, hey, the fact that it's become normal to say, public education doesn't matter that much, just so long as these kids are, well loved at home.
Yeah.
Like, you think there's no? I'm sure there's got to be some people on the left who value public education who are like red flag alert, right? And don't feel comfortable saying so.
So the reason I bring this up is because you were saying a few minutes ago, they are doing this. Depends on the they. And I think the motives for all these days right now are very different. I think there's a they, which would constitute the provincial government in Ontario. I don't know Quebec. Like, I've barely paid attention to my own province, but I know Quebec's doing some of the stuff. I know Alberta and BC. So forgive me for being Ontario-centric. They, meaning Doug Ford and his compatriots, they have an election 6 months away.
Yeah.
And they are scared shitless they're going to lose it because of this. And this is the nightmare they cannot escape. And they are doing nothing right. Like, there is, and I don't say this to defend anything they've done, because I think they're catastrophically stupid, but there is no easy scenario for them. I think we could say what the right thing to do is, but I cannot tell them what the politically easy, pain-free thing to do is, because there are none. There's also the they of some of Ontario's sort of public health thought leaders, which is kind of a weird term. I don't necessarily mean by their official positions, but by the people, by virtue of their gift of gab and social media presence, have become the voices of this. And I also think there's just members of the public who have handled this thing in their own way. You mentioned a few minutes ago, you asked me, is this nuts? And what has happened, I think, and that's why you'd said before, like, I've pulled you back before, but now we're more in alignment. I think reality has caught up where a lot of people on the right, we'll call it it's not as simple as that, but we'll call it the right. I think reality is caught up to where these people wanted it to be in waves 2 and 3 and 4.
I think that's right. Yep.
And I think, like, in the second and third waves, again, particularly in Ontario, and I know it's different in other jurisdictions, you had people on the right going, fuck it, we've done all we can, we've done this, we've done that, it's over. And then COVID gets the last word. And it sweeps through and does huge damage. And then individuals and politicians are basically forced into humiliating retreats. And saw this particularly in Ontario in April of last year. I remember I wrote a series of columns about this. There was about a week or two there where I do not know who was running Ontario, where the Ontario government was announcing emergency orders and then reversing them in hours. Like, Doug Ford is known for sort of the big catastrophic flip-flop, but he took the timeline from weeks to like days or hours. There was a period where, and again, I don't say this to be dramatic, but I'm just like a guy who's been watching Ontario politics for 10, 15 years. Anarchy would be the way of describing what was happening in the Ontario government. Like, the basic command and control functions of the Premier's office broke down for about a week. And I think now what's actually happening is that we are dealing, at least in terms of the virus, with a situation where reality is now where a lot of people, again, on the right, thought it was, or wished it was, or convinced themselves it was in waves 2, 3, and 4. We have a highly vaccinated population. We have a less aggressive version of the virus. The danger remains that our healthcare system is feeble and is prone to being toppled by the slightest breeze, that's not a trivial concern. Like I said before, right? Like
no, but but the problem is that like now we're talking about instituting these highly restrictive measures in order to try and salvage the feebleness of the healthcare system. And if that, it's not going to work, one, and also the precedent that sets when we are not in a pandemic, when we're not in a crisis, that's not a good thing. And I already start to see people talking about, well, people talk about how this is not as bad as the flu, but the flu is really bad, and maybe we should be implementing vaccine mandates for the flu vaccine, and maybe we should be implementing some of these MPIs for the flu. It's kind of unacceptable that 9,000 people die of the flu every year. It's like, what you've done is you've reset the bar of acceptable risk so low that you're now using highly restrictive, bluntly totalitarian measures to try and maintain this really insane, artificially low bar of risk. And that's the thing that people like me were worried about from the beginning. And that's the thing that people like me were freaking out about, because we're going like, even when we were talking about vaccine mandates, okay, I'm open to a conversation about vaccine mandates, but when does that end? What's the time frame or the metric by which you pull those back? Nobody's answered that question, and they haven't ended. Do we have to get booster shots now perpetually? And if we have to get booster shots perpetually, do the vaccine mandates simply become a new fact of our lives now? And because there was no pushback on a lot of this stuff, and any kind of conservative kind of protest to this was just disregarded as batshit crazy Neanderthals want people to die because of the economy. We're now in this situation where there wasn't the healthy push and pull to bring some of this stuff in. So now we're stuck with it, and we don't know how to pull it back, right? In some ways, the healthy function of any kind of society is a push and pull, right? Like you always kind of want, like you and I have, like you always kind of want someone like me and going, okay, but, and I might be wrong, but it's healthy to have me here saying like, okay, but what do we do in a year? You know what I mean? Yeah. And you also want the people on your side of the line saying like, no, we got to be cautious about this. This is ridiculous because of blah, 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 blah. We can't fix our healthcare system in 2 weeks. So we ought to do what we got to do. And like, in a healthy scenario, a healthy dichotomy, you have that back and forth. And what's happened over the last 2 years is that in the broader dialogue, that push and pull has just collapsed. And as a result, there's been effectively nothing but screaming conservatives who have been disregarded, trying to be like, no, there's some reasonable objections here. And they've just been bulldozed over. So now we have a scenario where we have basically governments implementing crazy pandemic theater that's highly restrictive over a disease that is no longer as dangerous as it once was.
The problem, I mean, I agree with that, but there is one important thing I have to mention here. This is a point I've made before, and I tell my most conservative friends this all the time. The worst enemy of a conservative is a conservative.
100%.
Because while these conservatives were making the point of we can't let these vax mandates become permanent, we have to prioritize children's education, they were also saying, and besides, the ICUs are fine.
Yeah. And they were saying like, oh, and besides, the vax mandates don't work because vaccinated people can also spread the disease.
Yeah.
Well, which is technically true, but if you're vaccinated, you're much, much less likely to get it in the first place. So like, that's the problem.
We were having about a month ago, I guess, where we're talking kind of the ACLU.
Mm-hmm.
And how you need something like the ACLU, but you need it to be beyond reproach. Mm-hmm. Because like I think we were talking about like the Justice Center, right?
Yeah.
And how it doesn't matter if you're doing God's work of maintaining the balance of personal liberties if you put a private eye tailing a judge.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like there's like conservatives have an important thing to add to the conversation, particularly in Canada, where we've gone so progressive and so left-wing in so many ways that like, you can fall off the edge of a cliff that way. But if you are like the party of batshit crazy screaming into the abyss,
it doesn't matter when you're right.
It doesn't
batshit crazy screaming.
That is fundamentally the problem with the whole dynamic that we're in this country. So all that to say is that I'm relieved that you and I are on the same page on this stuff. This is now crazy. there's no rationale for a lot of what's happening. My only hope in all of this is that Omicron is going to blow through this so quickly that, in 2 weeks, it's going to be unavoidable that these restrictions are not justifiable. That's my hope. Of course, it could be wrong. I mean, Denmark could be swamped tomorrow. I don't know, but we haven't seen it. And then what? I mean, what are we going to do to the people who have lost another 2 weeks of school? What are we going to do for the people?
I don't expect my kids to be back in the classroom before.
Which, by the way, is insane. That's insane.
My daughter is heartbroken to be missing out on class, and we haven't had the heart to tell my son yet that his hockey's canceled.
Yeah, like there's no rationale for that. That is completely nuts. That is completely effing goddamn nuts.
Let me tell you this. I would have listened to it if they told me what it was for. Like if they said to me, we're going to close down the schools for the next 2 weeks, during which time we will do A, B, C, D. And then, and while the hockey leagues are going to cut down, we're going to change protocols and blah, blah, blah. But we're not even bothering anymore. And this was
it's panic. Press the panic button, press the panic button, press the panic button. That's all it is.
And there was something that I noticed, and I've spoken about it with a few others in the Ontario press conference Monday morning when Doug Ford announced kind of the new 2 weeks of restrictions. Something that was really interesting was how almost every participant in it, and this is not intended as a criticism of anyone, I mean this is an observation, everybody was going through the motions.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to close school for 2 weeks. Reporter, well, what will they be? Why will they be able to open in 2 weeks? Well, we're really hopeful that in 2 weeks we'll have a better, this whole thing is Groundhog Day-esque at this point. And if the government actually needs to buy the healthcare system time, tell me what we need to do that and what we're going to use the time for.
Yep.
That's the benefit side of the cost benefit ratio. All we've got right now is
nobody can even make that
hope ratio, right? Like
all we have is doctors saying, well, we're just hoping this maybe slows the spread to buy us more time, as we're getting 20,000 COVID cases a day. It doesn't track. Like even if you're stopping 15% of the spread, the thing is so out of control now, none of this makes sense.
I've been talking to actual infection control experts, epidemiologists, public health leaders. I'm not arguing with Twitter randos. I'm actually talking to the people who would know this, and I'm saying to them, can we stop? In theory, could we stop the spread of something this infectious? In theory, sure. All we have to do is wear spacesuits. Like in the real world, no. You can't stop something this infectious. You can, flatten the curve and all the things we've talked about. But this thing is moving through the Ontario population like measles moves through a classroom of Jenny McCarthy's kids. Like you don't stop something like this. So if we're going to use all these NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, to try and slow this thing down, first of all, we will fail. Like we might slow it down a bit at the margins, but you're not going to stop this.
No.
And if we're not going to stop this, what is the point? And I'm not saying this in any sense of defeat. I'm not saying this in any sense of opposition. I want someone in authority to tell me what the sacrifice they have ordered my children to make is for. What is it for?
They can't, because it's not for anything aside from making them look like they're doing something.
Yeah, there's nothing. There's just no answer.
There's nothing. No.
So
that's where we are.
I want to mention one thing before we move on. We've gabbed about this enough. We got a couple of other items on the list. You and I are going to be rolling out some columns this week. This is the column I wanted to write. And it's been amazing to me over the last couple of days to see how rapidly I had told you, I guess, when did we talk last? Like Thursday?
Oh, no, like Thursday. Yeah, we did like a quick sort of, hey, you're still alive, right?
Yeah. The column I told you like 3 or 4 days ago I was planning to write this week has become so overwhelmingly more prescient.
Okay.
Well, you know what? I'm going to stick with that ocean liner analogy. Imagine it's a pretty small boat, and you and I and all of our other soon-to-be shipwreck buddies, we're bailing with buckets as much as we can, right? At what point does it become reasonable to concede that it's not going to work? Like, when do you make that prevention to mitigation pivot?
There's a point where you have to realize that bailing out the ocean liner is just wasting energy that you're going to need on the deserted island. Yeah, when you're in the water.
I'm fascinated by that same psychological dynamic playing out again. When do we, and I'm a guy who was fairly militant about, like, let's take this thing on, let's crush the curve, let's protect the hospitals. Omicron comes along, I look at the infectivity of this thing and I go, oh, we're fucked. Like, this thing is more contagious than anything we are realistically capable of doing is going to stop. So what's the new plan? And there are a lot of people out there, and there's not a comment on them as people, but it's just an interesting observation I've made. I mentioned before, I talked to a lot of epidemiologists, I talked to a lot of infection control guys. Almost without exception, they will tell you, if you ask, they're saying the quiet part quietly, but they say, yeah, you don't contain something this contagious, not without shutting down a society in a way that will kill people. But there are people out there who are still demanding, lock it down, close the schools, masks for everyone. And I'm wondering, at a certain point, when does an inability to pivot from prevention to mitigation not become a public policy question? When is it a psychological one?
Oh, we're there. Yeah. I mean, here's one thing that I think that I'm not sure maybe you understood it when it came to discussions with me, but you said, like, you think we are now where conservatives, a lot of people on the right, imagined we were 2 or 3 waves ago. That is true, except what I think it probably doesn't take into consideration is that people like me 2 or 3 waves ago had reached this point. We had reached this point where realistically there's nothing more to be done. We're in the diminishing returns curve, and everything that we impose upon ourselves in order to mitigate future losses is going to become progressively more and more expensive and more unreasonable for the deaths and preventions that it will cost. So I was there last wave. It's not that I underestimated that, for example, Alberta's 4th wave or 3rd wave was bad or catastrophic. I didn't underestimate that at all. I was pretty clear-eyed about, yeah, we're heading into triage. That is going to happen. In fact, effectively, we kind of did head into triage. Like, people who have an 80% chance of survival aren't going to get medical care. Like, I was not under denial about any of that. I was, like, very clear-eyed about it. I was like, yep, that's what's going to happen, and there's no. But I'd reached the point where I think you've reached now, where I'm like, and there's really nothing more to be done.
Yeah, but the problem was, when you reached that point, there were still things to be done. Like, we weren't done vaccinating yet. Like, people were declaring.
Oh no, but no. But I'm talking about by the time we had reached, like, the peak of the 4th wave, where it was like it was. We were. I mean, the problem in Alberta was a unique one, and maybe not applicable to other places, because I thought that we had reached, I mean, obviously our public health actually thought that we had reached the threshold necessary to vaccinate. And it turns out there were these geographic pockets that were under vaccinated, and I didn't realize that. And that's why we got this back. So you're right. In hindsight, it was easy to say, oh, there was more to be done. We needed to vaccinate those pockets, or we needed to shut down those pockets. Like, in hindsight, that was easy, but that wasn't, I'm saying after that point where I'm talking like November of last year, you know what I'm saying? Like, after we had reached the point where we had thought that everybody could be vaccinated and the thing just went through. It's just that there was a realization that, I mean, even that, getting those pockets vaccinated, how are we going to force them to do that? Like,
Omicron's going to take care of that for us.
Well, Omicron's already taking care of that for us. I mean, like, the idea that you were going to impose vaccine mandates in rural Alberta and that these were going to be enforced or obeyed I mean, this was all fantasy. So this is where the point where I had reached the last wave, where I was just like, practically speaking, yeah, maybe there's some marginal stuff we could be doing at the edges. I'm not opposed to doing any of that marginal stuff. I was never opposed to masks, for example. Yep. Fine, impose the masks. But practically speaking, all of the stuff that we're doing now is going to make a marginal impact. And as this thing goes on and on and on, for these marginal impact measures, the costs are getting respectively higher and higher and higher. So like, as I said, the classic diminishing returns curve, we reached it. So, but it wasn't that I was not clear-eyed about how bad it was. I was very clear-eyed that it was really bad, but I just reached the point where realistically there was really nothing more to be done except just accept the cost and ride it out. That was where I was the last wave, is what I would say.
I think one of the problems with this, though, and I was saying this to another friend today, is that everything we talk about has to be filtered through the minds of politicians.
Oh yeah, that I can't think like a politician. They're fucked up.
But I think it's more than that, though, right? Because I was saying to a buddy that we have to avoid the temptation to treat this public health emergency like it's high school debate club, where everyone will have a rational argument that can be weighed against each other. The problem we have in Ontario now is not a problem with a virus. It's not a problem with a healthcare system. It's a problem with Doug Ford trying to figure out what the fuck to do.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
And I think like all of our, we can throw charts of Danish hospital admission data at each other, or slides of the spike protein of Omicron. The only thing that matters is figuring out what Doug Ford is going to do and what is likely to get him there. And I think that's kind of been, I think in this whole thing, like I said before, we've handled this thing from our usual ideological filter bubbles. I think what we haven't done a good job on is realizing that whatever my opinion is and your opinion, a hypothetical generic you,
sure, yeah,
it doesn't matter, because it's all got to run through Doug Ford's brain.
Are you saying that all of our opinions don't matter, Matt?
To an extent.
Are you saying our opinions don't matter? No, you're right. And this is where we move from some analysis of COVID to political analysis. And I'm hoping you do that in that column. Yeah. By the way, we do have to transition to other topics, because we've been like going on about this for a really long time. There's obviously so much to say, though. So I'm just going to blast through the last two topics really quickly.
Before we do that, for the record,
okay.
I have purged perhaps 3% of my anger in this conversation.
Oh, good. That's good. Leave lots of it, because we'll get the rest of it out on writing, and then we'll send it out to the universe.
Being fed into the grinder here, and no one can tell me why.
Nobody's telling you why.
We have to do something.
We have to do something.
Okay.
To
accomplish what? No one knows.
Your kids don't really matter.
No.
This is the way we've responded to COVID is an intergenerational crime that exists to benefit the old at the expense of the young, and your kids don't really matter, Matt.
You and I and a few others were making this point last month in December before the break. We are now officially in the every man for himself stage of this thing.
Yep. Okay, so Tara Henley.
You have to explain this one to me, because I don't know this person.
Okay, so this is someone who did freelance stuff for the Globe and other places, was a longtime employee of the CBC. And she wound up quitting the CBC and writing this big Substack article about basically the situation at the CBC being essentially overrun, ideologically overrun, to the extent that she felt that she couldn't continue to work there and still maintain her journalistic integrity. So she starts with Substack, and I'll quote you some of the best parts here. When I started, by the time I resigned from the CBC last month, it embodied some of the worst trends in mainstream media. In a short period of time, the CBC went from being a trusted source of news to turning out clickbait that reads like a parody of the student press. Ouch. Those of us on the inside know just how swiftly and how dramatically the politics of the public broadcaster have shifted. To work at the CBC in the current climate is to embrace cognitive dissonance and to abandon journalistic integrity. So where I find this really interesting, Matt, is that the CBC is a very, very complicated place. It isn't one organization, as well you know. It's multiple organizations within a monstrous absolutely monstrous bureaucratic nightmare.
And different
And
factions within those.
there are different factions that exist within these sub-organizations. There are different silos. CBC Calgary is not CBC Edmonton, is not CBC Vancouver, is not CBC Toronto, and there are going to be
Calgary. The sports guys and the anchors and the reporters are different.
And in CBC Toronto, you've got the business people don't really talk to other, and actually there's an extraordinary amount of internecine kind of fighting and turf war that happens within these groups. Like, the CBC is not one entity. The CBC is a monstrous hydra of entities. And like, there are jobs I would consider taking at the CBC, and there are jobs that I would never touch with a 10-foot pole, just because the culture is so problematic, and like, their internal sense of self is so fractured now that a lot of the times when you have problems, particularly with the comment section or with their first person section, it's rooted in this fundamental unwillingness to understand what role it is and what place it's serving in the Canadian media market. Like, the CBC is a mess. So I won't say that Tara's experience can be extrapolated to everybody's experience within the CBC. It almost certainly cannot be. But what she is writing about is very consistent with what other people have told me about their experiences within certain silos of the CBC. This sort of broad-based ideological shift that is increasingly coming up into conflict with traditional journalistic norms. Again, this isn't unique to the CBC, but it certainly is happening there. And it's been very profound there. And what she's saying is, on the whole, from my understanding, generally true.
Yeah.
Now, the question that you and I both have for Tara is whether she did, like, this is a barn burner of an essay on the way out, and it's quite the way to launch a Substack. The question that I would have for her is how she plans to actually build an audience, a paying audience from here. Like I think you had mentioned that this just reads like the same rant that you've heard from every other red pill journalist. And, she's not going to write a Substack just bitching about the CBC all the time. So how does she transition this into a Substack worth reading, generating enough of an audience to make a living? I think that is her challenge now. And, welcome to the Substack family. Wish her nothing but luck. But that's going to be difficult for her, I think.
It's interesting. First of all, I did read her essay. You sent it to me this morning. I did read it. It is interesting. I agree with it in the main. I like talking about newsrooms becoming increasingly unmoored from stories the audiences care about in favor of stories your fellow journalists will tweet about is a real problem. And I agree with that. The one thing I would say, though, is that you mentioned it's not exclusive to the CBC. You're right. But we've talked about some of these publicly and some of them we haven't. CBC seems to be having a whole hell of a lot of these lately. Not all of them are publicly known. So there's something
that's right.
going on at the CBC. So I'm interested in this mostly from the perspective of, what is this going to do? Like, is this actually going to tip things over? My guess would be no, but hey, I've been wrong before. The other thing you said, though, and this is where my skepticism comes in, red pill journalists in a rapidly contracting media environment are dime a dozen. And I don't know this woman, and if she happens to see this, no offense, like I'm not making this comment about you personally, but every essay like this reads the same. Like, like you and I have joked about this before. Like, it's kind of like, and that's why I'm joining The Athletic. Like, all of these things read the same. It's like, are you ready for the kind of stories we couldn't tell you on the inside for only $5 a month? I'm okay with that. Like, the line is a business. We're running a business. We're entrepreneurs here. I get it. I want you to subscribe too. But the problem is, there is a limited market that is ever going to be interested in this sort of thing. It's a pretty well-served market. I don't know who this woman is, and I don't, again, no offense to her. I'm reasonably well established within the Canadian journalistocracy, right? I hadn't heard of this person.
Yeah.
And I don't think she has a huge profile. It's not to say she's not a great person or doing great work, but the people who have succeeded at this have basically gone,
10.
I have a massive profile and I've
Yeah.
taken my audience with me.
Yeah, and even in Canadian spaces, like a massive profile is 1/10 of what a comparable American writer would have. So, scale has always been a problem. It's a problem for us at the line. Scale is a huge issue. She might do just fine. I don't think this is not the way. I mean, I think people often treat stuff like this as like, oh, you grifter, you're just doing this for the money. Trust me, the easy money for her was to stay employed at the CBC in her nice union job. That is where the easy money was for her. But if she honestly felt this way, as she explained in this essay, you can't stay in that easy money job and be happy with yourself and be happy with your life, in which case you kind of have to leave.
There is something interesting happening, though. A point you and I have made before. One of the things we have wanted to avoid doing at the line is, and something you and I have talked about since before we published our first post. So we basically we actually talked about doing this for about 5 years, but then we actually planned it in about 5 days.
We just did it.
Yeah, we're kind of weird that way. One of the things we agreed we did not want to do was be the people, and I can think of like a half a dozen Canadians who are doing some version of the mainstream media is an asshole. Donate now.
Yeah.
Like that's the grift, right? Like all these other places start up and it's only we will tell you the truth. Subscribe today. These assholes are lying to you. Buy a mug. And like there are some people who do this.
Hey, our mugs are awesome. Thank you.
So there are people who do this at a big scale. There's people who do this at a little scale. You and I had a conversation that we were never going to do that. We were going to criticize the media when we got it wrong. We were going to praise it when it got it right. Like we were never going to try to pretend that we were the only truth seekers out there who would tell.
This is why we don't make more money.
Yeah. But I think we probably have a more sustainable model. It's just going to take longer.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And like as I said, the goal here for me was never making money. The goal here was to create a perch where I could speak my truth, because I'm actually that asshole.
Yeah.
I'm an idealist. Shit. That's the real problem. So anyway, Tara, and then there's another little note, and that was Joe Rogan not being allowed to come to Vancouver because he's apparently not vaccinated, even though he's had COVID. I think this is an interesting little note where I think the right-wing culture warriors maybe have a point. I think there's no procedure in place for someone with like a positive antibody test to come into Canada, and I think that's a little nuts. That's maybe a little nuts.
Look, you know me. I'm a big Toronto Maple Leafs fan. Which explains a lot of my life dissatisfaction. But Austin Matthews has COVID again. He had it before. He's got it again because something we know about Omicron is that it evades immunity. You will get sick. We believe that vaccination or prior infection blunts the severity of the illness. One of the things we're going to have to do, and by the way, we won't do this because that's kind of the meta theme of our conversation today. There's a lot of things we ought to be doing that we won't and aren't doing. What is the purpose of mask mandates and vaccine mandates and all those things? I support both of them, and I still do. But we're going to have a conversation about what the point of them is. And
it's not to stop the illness. At this point, mask and vaccine mandates are about the mask mandates are about ensuring that people demonstrate vigilance by doing something that requires them to take an action. So it's about it's a psychological thing, and the vaccine mandates are about punishing people who won't get the vaccine. That's what it is. It's a stick. That's all it is. None of these things are actually about stopping the spread of Omicron, because they effectively are marginal tools for that.
I haven't looked at anything that speaks specifically to the efficacy of masks in Omicron, but when it comes to vaccine mandates, yes, it's a stick.
Yeah.
We will punish you for not doing the thing we want you to do. We will make your life incrementally harder until you do the thing that is to the benefit of society, which I've actually generally been okay with.
Well, Well, that's always been my issue with the mask mandates, is that there was never any clear metric for when these things stopped. the cloth masks. So the cloth masks did show incremental usefulness with the earlier waves of COVID. Like, and we're not talking like it didn't stop 100% transmission, but it maybe stopped 10%. So it was on a mass scale. It made sense to do. With Omicron, like I think you would need to be diligently using the N95s and using them properly. And like almost nobody, not even medical healthcare workers, are using N95s properly most of the time. So like, you know, the proper N95s would probably be making a difference, but nobody actually has those. Nobody uses them properly. So
and yet again, I mean, as the column I intend to write, we've got to start thinking about our pivots.
Yeah.
When do we pivot from where we've been up until now, prevention? When do we pivot to, I don't even want to say mitigation. I think I'm just going to say like endurance. And then what do we do when it's over?
Yeah. And how do we decide it's over? How do we decide that it's endemic? It's endemic.
From the very beginning, one of the things I've always said is that whenever it actually is over, there will be a political lag time. It's just like, when it might end in February, the politicians might start to suspect it's over in May. They might propose doing something about it in June, and then actually do it in November, right?
Yeah, like because the incentive is always going to be for precautionary principle. Yeah. So like that's fine. Also, but then to be honest with you, the rest of us are just and also, but I mean, like here in Alberta, people are just moving on. We're living our lives, right? So that's just what it is.
Toronto, Jen, people are
just they're over it.
Deepest Toronto, it's different this time.
All right, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so Matt, I'm going to do a quick intro. I'm going to write like, hey, here's your Omicron update. Here's what it looks like. You have a lot of rage to get out, so I'm going to get you to talk about this is fucking nuts. The Ontario stuff, this is fucking nuts. Why are my children being asked to sacrifice this? I'm going to take on Tara Henley. Do we want to do Joe Rogan? That's a lot.
The other thing we just need to do is we need to remind the viewers / listeners kind of that our business plan for this year is basically stay the course. We will offer one more sale opportunity to jump in at a discount for the year, which will expire 6 days from now. And that we will be increasingly putting more stuff behind the paywall. Yep. So just a business update, a welcome back. You want me to do? Yeah, you know what? Why don't, if you don't mind, can you do the shorties on like business, welcome back business, Omicron update, and then do the Rogan and Henley shorties, and then I'll just do a fiery mouthful of rage.
Just rage it out. Just get your anger out.
I've poked already a couple of our other contributors just to say, hey guys, we're doing a surprise dispatch. You want to say anything? I don't know. Maybe they will.
Yep. This has already been like a really long video. We should probably spare our poor listeners at this point, all 300 of them, whom I love, by the way.
They're great.
They're so great. Like we've got 300 people who just like
than what Doug Ford did to them.
They deserve better than our angry ramblings.
Oh no, they pay for our ramblings. They
pay for our ramblings. That's true. Yes, I agree. We like you guys. You're great. We should actually talk about trying to turn the audio of this into a podcast, because I actually think we'd get more play if we did that. But anyway,
didn't Substack just actually add that as a feature?
Yes, they did. We should just is there a way to just
record this? I can export audio only.
All right, let's just do that then.
Okay.
All right.
Why not?
All right, let's just try it. Let's just try it.
I don't know if that's easy or hard, so that might take me more time, but let's find out.
There's no rush. Let's see if we can do that for like the Friday. Let's not worry about it today.
Good point. Okay.
All right.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Bye.